Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my presentation titled Feedback as a Conversation, Commenting that Drives Student Engagement. My name is Natalie DeSorbo. I'm a first-year writing course coordinator and assistant teaching professor at Rutgers University in the Rutgers Writing Program. And I'm so happy that you're joining me today. So today I will share current scholarship on dialogic feedback and translingual approaches to writing, demonstrate feedback methods on student writing samples, and explain how to apply these practices to your classroom. There will be a special focus on responding to multilingual student work, but these practices extend to all writing classrooms. And as you can see from the agenda, I'm going to give a little bit of background on myself and the inspiration for this presentation. I will tell you the principles of what I am calling feedback as a conversation. We'll look at the scholarship and samples of student writing, and there will be some classroom activities as takeaways to teach your students how to converse and have this conversation during feedback. And then we'll end with my contact information. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I received my Bachelor of Arts in East Asian Languages and Cultures from Rutgers University. I specialized in Mandarin Chinese. I then went on to get my teaching degree in TESOL from the College of New Jersey, and currently I am at Rutgers University. I am a first-year writing coordinator. In that role, I support faculty and I work with a team to assess the curriculum. And I am an assistant teaching professor, and I specialize currently in English for academic purposes courses, which support our international and multilingual student population. My inspiration for this presentation, and more broadly this topic, comes from a quote by Kwame Anthony Appiah, the renowned philosopher. In past EAP classes, we would use a section of his book, Cosmopolitanism, as an assigned text. This is a quote that always stood out to me as I was teaching the students. He says, "The beginnings of conversations across boundaries of identity, whether it be national, religious, or something else, come with the sort of imaginative engagement you get when you read a novel or watch a movie or attend to a work of art that speaks from some place other than your own." So I'm using the word conversation not only for literal talk, but also as a metaphor for engagement with the experience and ideas of others. And I really prescribe to this idea, his philosophy of conversation as engagement with the experience and ideas of others. This type of imaginative engagement really resonates with me. Conversation is not just for talking, right? It's for listening and learning. And I believe that this idea can be applied to the way that we as teachers engage with student writing, in particular, how we provide feedback to students. So before we dive into the literature, here are some principles of what I am calling feedback as a conversation. This method invites instructors to do the following. Be curious, being an inquisitive and empathetic reader, being mindful of tone. This is both in when we are speaking to the students or when we are providing written feedback. Generating and negotiating meaning together. This comes from the idea of dialogic feedback, which there's a lot of research on. Collaborating together on meaning. So shifting the power dynamic from the teacher as the ultimate authority and the student as a vessel to we both bring something to the discussion. We both have different levels of knowledge and we come from different places. So let's collaborate. Honoring cultural background and linguistic expertise, which is leaning into translingual approaches to pedagogy. Shifting perspective from error to opportunity, and encouraging student creativity. So looking through the scholarship and the student writing samples, these principles will come to life. When we are looking at the writing samples, just a note that I have removed student names for anonymity and received permission to share these samples. So the scholarship that informs the practice of feedback as conversation. This, like I said before, can apply to all writing classrooms, but based on my background in TESOL, I am going to be focusing on multilingual student writing samples, and there is a special focus on translingual pedagogy. So I found David Carlis's work on dialogic feedback as an essential baseline for this discussion. He defines dialogic feedback as an interactive exchange in which interpretations are shared, meanings negotiated, and expectations clarified. And I think the inspiration that I found in Appiah's quote extends this discussion of feedback to how we engage with, for example, multilingual student writing. Sharing and negotiating meaning are a huge part of feedback as dialogue or conversation. Especially if we see conversation as Appiah does, the engagement with experiences and ideas across boundaries of identity. It is knowing that our students' ideas and language use may come from a place different than our own, right? And cross-culturally, being aware of that and being prepared to provide feedback with this in mind. Another work that I heavily relied on is Feedback Conversations by Sarah Lacey. And she really focuses on the students having an active role in the learning process. So collaboration in meaning making is key. If feedback is a dialogue or conversation, students are active participants. They learn that they have a say in how their writing progresses. And as an extension, they must be engaged beyond just receiving, right? So this is an excerpt from a student essay that shows how the student and I needed to collaborate on meaning. In this example, I was able to model some vocabulary research and my thought process out loud for the student, and it ended up being a really fascinating experience for us both. So the student is writing about Jhumpa Lahiri, the author, and he is saying at the end of this excerpt here, if we try to learn a new language, we should put ourselves in a new environment which you can immediately suiting that language. And so I'm really interested in his idea. I just don't fully understand it yet. So we got together for a one-on-one conference, which I often require at least one of those each semester. And I said to him, hey, I think you have a really great idea here. I just need help understanding it a little bit more. Can you tell me what you mean by suiting? And he said, oh, like suit meaning to match something. And I said, okay, so the language matches or fits into the environment. And he said, yeah, like it belongs in the environment, like you use it in that environment. I said, okay, so do you mean that the person should be involved in an environment where the language is usually used? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, I think what you mean, let me know if this is correct. I think you mean that somebody should be surrounded by that language, right? Be in an environment where you are surrounded or immersed in that language. And the student said, oh, yes, like that is what I'm trying to say. And actually, it turns out that Jhumpa Lahiri in her writing uses the word immersed. And so I was able to show the student how to go back to the text and model the way that she was using that word choice, right? And so this is a situation where we had a back and forth. It was kind of fun. It was kind of silly. But it was not a situation where I told the student, I want you to use this specific word, right? I gave the student the space where we could work together and try and figure out which word he wanted to use and what word we landed on that he thought matched his idea. He had a say in it. We had to negotiate together. And this kind of exchange took maybe a couple of minutes in a one-on-one conference, which I think would be, a more appropriate place to do something like this rather than, let's say, through writing. It would be a little bit more like arduous that way. So I also was looking at a lot of literature on first year composition classes and multilingual students, and I found this really great quote from Anjanette Grego, in which she is talking about a statement that the 4 C's the Committee on the Four Cs had created in 1974, saying, "We affirm the students' rights to their own pattern and variety of language," right? And the language and culture of a student are valued in the mainstream composition classroom. And this is what I was speaking about before in terms of honoring where the students are coming from. Okay, so language transfers are not viewed as an obstruction or an inconvenience or a failure to write in English. They are viewed as an opportunity for cross-cultural conversations within feedback practices. And as an extension of that, feedback can be a really great place to explore creative opportunities. Going back to Appia saying like this imaginative engagement, right? There is room for creativity in the interactions that we have if we are using feedback in a conversational or dialogic, manner. So, it allows us as the teacher to investigate how the students arrive at their choices. And feedback as a conversation allows students to voice their purpose. You can hear the students' rationale and know that there is a logic behind the choice, even though it is not immediately apparent to you. For multilingual students, remember that they navigate English with prior knowledge from their first language. This is an example of an elevator pitch a student created for me. Note that there are two types of feedback here: technical feedback regarding word forms, grammar, and dialogic feedback in which I ask the student to explain their thought process to me for a phrase that stood out. Regarding the comment on word forms, I noticed this was a pattern in the student's writing. You can see the student is saying strangers are noisily, and then later on in the elevator pitch, she says the environment will soon become quietly. So because I noticed a pattern, this was an opportunity for me to say, hey, you're using the adverb forms right now, but you need to use the adjective forms. I have noticed a pattern. Just keep this in mind throughout the rest of your writing, right? Because it was a pattern, I thought that it warranted feedback, right? This is a quick note on selective feedback for patterns of errors, not commenting on every single grammar error, right? But what's really fascinating to me is this phrase, when you have a rebellious brain. Okay, for rebellious brain, I was curious. Sure, this is not a common collocation in English, but I see the creativity in the student's thinking here, and I want to encourage it and have the student define her own term rather than remove it or normalize it. This would be an instance of being more open-minded about what constitutes a mistake. Okay, so my investigation or our conversation led to the student telling me that this word choice came from a Chinese idiom, and I've included it here, 乱七八糟. So this actually refers to something being extremely disorderly or chaotic. And she, when I asked her, I said, hey, this is a really interesting idea, rebellious brain. Could you tell me about it? And she said, oh, yeah, I picked that word because I was thinking about this idiom in Chinese. And she very briefly told me about this idiom, and there is a historical context to it. As you can see, the historical context is that at some point in history there was a rebellion, and rebellions are messy and chaotic and disorderly. And so she took that literal idea of rebellion and she applied it to the idea of the brain, and when we feel like we can't think straight or when things are too noisy and busy. And I just thought this was so fascinating. Right? And so my perspective is, if my student can justify the reasoning for their choice, and if there is logic in that decision and clarity in the idea, the creativity prevails. The cultural background and expertise of that student prevails. Now, of course, the limitation to this is this type of thinking is dependent on context and genre. Yes, an elevator pitch needs to be clear, concise, and convincing, but it's an advertisement, so there is room for creativity. That might not be the same case for an informational or argumentative essay, right? So it's all about context. I came out of this conversation with the student knowing and learning something new, right? And so I did not make the student delete and find some quote unquote normal way in English to say this. I'm telling her instead, hey, let's leave this creative phrasing in, but you might need to add a phrase or a sentence that describes, or that explains or defines what you mean by rebellious brain, just in case your audience might not understand that. Okay, so going back to Sarah Lacy's work in feedback conversations, and these feedback conversations is what she calls a kind of activity she would do with her students in Google Documents. She would have the students upload their essays in Google Docs, and she would provide feedback, with the commenting function, and then she would require her students to reply to her marginal comments. And so it was an ongoing dialogue like that. But through that experience, she found that her role, the role that her tone played in providing feedback, was so crucial to how the students receive and apply that feedback. She had noted that many of her students, depending on how she phrased things in her comments, they might see themselves as failures, or that they failed in English, or they failed in their essay. And this is incredibly discouraging as a teacher. This is not what we want the students to think. And so tone plays a huge role. And as another extension to that, I think tone leads to what is being said in this quote. To what extent multilingual students become that open and responsive for negotiating meaning depends on their imagined possibilities and imagined identities. So what kind of possibilities do the students think they have in their writing, in their identity as a writer? Okay. And I want to show first an example of a type of feedback that I am guilty of in the past. We all might have created feedback like this one time or another. Phrases like fixed language, awkward wording, I don't follow your idea, this is not usually how we say something in English. If we provide feedback like this, deficit-based, no clear direction or actionable information, no inquiry, no curiosity, what possibilities can be imagined for our students? How does feedback like this help shape their identity as a writer, as a multicultural writer, right? How does it show them the possibilities within their writing? My argument is that it doesn't, right? For multilingual students especially, imagine them misinterpreting something like this phrase, I don't follow your idea. Yes, follow can mean understanding here, but follow also can mean support. So what if the student misinterprets this as, I don't support your idea, right? I don't like your idea. That would be at the detriment of the student. The student thinks you're not invested, right? And you're just kind of quickly, giving them something and then leaving it at that. I really want to keep in mind, think detective, not judge. A detective is curious, right? Sure, maybe the judging aspect will come when you are assigning a grade, right? During the assessment process. But in a rough draft like this, curiosity, I think, is the key here. And so here's what I envision that curiosity to look like in this dialogic feedback, or feedback as conversation. Feedback that engages the student in conversation, not just as talk, but as engaging meaningfully with their ideas and their language choices. Instructors approach the task of providing feedback with a tone of curiosity. So the questioning on the left, where I'm asking by general person, right? And this student is writing, we watched sections of the Barbie movie by Greta Gerwig, and the student is talking about how Barbie wants to become human, right? And the student is saying that Barbie wants to become a general person. So I asked the student, by general person, do you mean she wants to experience what humans usually do? Or perhaps that she wants to fit into society? Let me know if this aligns with your thought process. This type of questioning and curiosity will help the students confirm if the audience, me in this sense, has correctly understood their idea. If yes, okay, great, tell me more, let's expand on that idea. If not, no worries, explain to me what you meant to say. Let's collaborate, right, and help you revise this section of your writing. The conversation can continue in office hours, in the reply function of something like Canvas or Blackboard, whatever LMS you're using, as a reflective assignment, while I'm walking around, as the students are doing independent work. There are a lot of opportunities. On the right, the student is saying Barbie can feel the different colors of life more closely. And I really like the way the student worded this, but I do recognize there are some details missing, and the way that it is phrased, there needs to be a little bit more clarity. So I told the student, I want you to define this unique phrase for your audience, whether that is one or two more sentences or, adding on to the sentence that they already created. And I gave the student questions to help them start thinking. So I'm not telling the student to remove this, right? This doesn't sound right. This isn't how we say it in English. I'm not telling the student to do that. Hey, I want my student to be creative. Why don't you leave that in there? But if you're going to leave this in there, I do think you need to define, your phrasing or explain the terminology that you're using or that you're creating. Okay? I did think that there was space for creativity here. The last feedback that I gave, this last part, the student is saying, life is not black and white, not that everyone likes to respect Barbie on Barbie Land. This was where I was struggling the most with the student's writing. I'm not really sure what the student is saying, but I want to show the power of the word yet. I told the student, I don't understand this idea yet, but it has potential. Please explain it to me so we can revise together. Okay? There is support, right? There is potential. I would hope that this comment shows the student, hey, this is not, you are not failing. This is not a failure. This is just, I just need a little bit more explanation. Let's work on clarity together, and we will get you to that clear, detailed, logical idea. Now, as a limitation, I recognize that this type of feedback is time-consuming work. But valuing someone else's ideas, helping a student grow as a writer, requires investment, which requires time commitment. We are already providing feedback to students, right? So why not use that time that we need to use, right, by providing feedback that shows that we are curious, shows that we are engaged, shows that we are interested, and that we are invested. My suggestion in terms of the time commitment is, if you can do this type of work on at least one rough draft during a semester, that would be a fantastic start to this practice. If you can require one-on-one or small group conferences at least once during the semester, that is an opportunity to provide feedback as conversation, right? I acknowledge that this might not be accessible, or doable for every single draft, every single paper, right? So starting small, incorporating these types of practices in whatever way you can. It takes time to listen, learn, and respond, right? So I want to show some classroom activities because I also was recognizing in many cases our students don't know how to engage in a dialogue about their work. So we need to teach them and have them practice this. They may not have that experience in high school, let's say, right? So there are many ways that we can foster and practice this within our classrooms. First, I would explicitly tell them the purpose, right? During this peer review, we are practicing how to be curious, or this conference is so that we can collaborate on meaning together to talk and come to an understanding. So being explicit about your purpose as a teacher and why you are engaging in that dialogue. And here are some class activities that I use to model feedback, for these students, feedback as a conversation for these students. So, like I was mentioning with Sarah Lacey's work with feedback conversations, requiring the students to reply to your marginal comments as a revision assignment. You can do this in whatever LMS that you use. We use Canvas at Rutgers University, in Google Docs, or you can even assign a reflection essay. Sarah Lacey did mention that she does tell the students that there will be a participation grade. She noticed that when she included the participation grade, the quantity of engagement and the quality of engagement is significantly increased. So that is kind of what she, suggests. Scheduling one-on-one or small group conferences. This is a great place for that collaborating or negotiating meaning together. And then some engaging kind of like active learning activities. I like to focus on question-based revision activities. So this could be a museum walk in which the students bring in a printed copy of an excerpt from their paper. We post it on the wall. The students walk around. They can have a piece of paper, or if you have access to Post-it notes, the students can ask questions that way. And I just have them ask questions. I find that is the best form of feedback that peers can give to their classmates. Speed dating, I have the students set up the desks in 2 rows. They have multiple partners. They get up and move around. They're staying awake, right? They're having fun. And also the students have multiple partners, meaning we avoid the issue of one student putting in more effort than their one partner, right? We avoid that kind of issue. And also the students can find patterns in the feedback that multiple people are providing them. So this is an example of a situation where I had the student reply to my comments, and all of my comments were question-based. I was working with the students on content, on expanding their ideas, adding details. And so you can see the student, the name is removed here, but the student had replied directly to my questions. And then I instruct those students to apply what they wrote in that comment to me, put it into their essay, right? Use that for the revision. And this is an example of a question focused peer review in which I am showing the students directions. I am saying in the directions, time to be curious, create questions, right? I give them models of questions, and I also model my thought process for asking questions on a, example piece of writing. Thank you so much for being here and in listening to my presentation. I had such a really great time looking at the literature, thinking about my practices as a teacher, reflecting on how I can engage with my student writing and provide feedback more effectively, more respectfully, in a more engaged kind of and curious manner. And so I hope that you will do the same. So please feel free to reach out to me and start a conversation. I have my email here and my LinkedIn. I would be so happy to connect with you and talk more about these feedback practices and teaching in general. It would be such a pleasure. Thank you again.